Hello everyone and welcome to the continuation of the match Viswanathan Anand versus Magnus Carlsen from the round 5 of the Norway Chess 2022. It's not actually a match, it's really a game, but if the classical game ends up in a draw, then the Armageddon game is played. So if more than one game is played, I guess it does make it a match. I'm calling it a match. We will have a repetition of the opening from the classical game, but only briefly. Things will get crazy very quickly. You guys will see what I mean by this. Let's check it out. So Anand with the white pieces opens with e4. We have e5 by Magnus, knight f3, knight to c6, and bishop to c4. So the Italian game, same as in their classical game. Knight to f6, Magnus replies with the two knights defense and the d3. And here in the classical game, Magnus went for the bishop to e7 line, but here he goes for bishop to c5. And those two are pretty much equally played. They are the two main continuations against this d3 line. Bishop to g5, as now the bishop is not on e7, so it makes sense to develop our bishop to g5. And now usually black will just play h6 here. But Magnus plays bishop back to e7. So this bishop to c5 to e7 is an incredibly rare continuation. I don't even know if it's real, but Magnus plays it and he wants to confuse Anand very, very early on. So here, knight to c3, Anand continues development, d6, and now pawn to a4. So just very, very standard moves, castles, and now pawn to a5. And this is now a new move. There is a game where Mikhail Antipov played h3 against Sergei Karyakin in the 2020 Russian Championship, where Karyakin was able to win that game. But here, after a5, it is already, as of move 8, that we have a completely new game. So Magnus playing the weird bishop c5 to e7 maneuver, but it is Anand who creates a completely new game. And okay, bishop to g4, Magnus develops the bishop, h3, and he gives up the bishop for knight. Captures, and now knight to d4. An active square for the knight, forcing the queen to go back to guard the c2 pawn. So Anand plays queen back to d1. c6, we are preparing the b5 pawn push, and now Anand just castles. We have b5, and now you would expect a captures on b6 en passant, but Anand just brings the bishop back. Bishop to a2, we have knight back to e6, challenging the bishop here, and bishop back to e3. So Anand keeping the bishop pair for the moment. We have a6. Of course, the pawn cannot be captured. If you capture the pawn, you just blunder a piece, because the rook would be attacking the queen. So I hope none of you were looking at that pawn. So here, pawn to a6 and queen to f3. Developing the queen, connecting the rooks. We have queen to d7 by Magnus. He does the same. And now knight to e2. Preparing the standard c3, and then we are going to push stuff. Magnus says, I will start pushing before you. He says d5. We have c3, and now bishop to c5. Offering a trade of dark square bishops. E captures on d5, c captures, and now bishop captures on c5. We have knight captures and d4. Challenging Carlsen's knight on c5, but it would be silly to just move the knight without first grabbing more space in the center. So this is exactly what Magnus does. Queen to e3, and now knight to d3. And here Magnus has a beautifully placed knight on d3, targeting the b2 pawn. So Anand goes back, queen to d2, and now rook a to e8. And we could say that Magnus is enjoying his position very, very much. But Anand says, your knight is very nicely placed on d3, but maybe we can undermine it. f3. Now, of course, if you capture, I'm just going to capture the knight here. Here, Magnus finds a beautiful move, knight to f2. What kind of a move is that? Well, he's saying if you capture, I'm just going to capture back with this knight. Because if you capture the knight, I'm just going to play e3 and win material here. So here we have f captures on e4, and Magnus just picks up the pawn back. Knight 2 captures on e4, attacks the queen, queen to d3, and now queen to d6. Now controlling the g3 square, so it's very hard to activate this knight. Rook to f3, Anand preparing rook a to f1, and now pawn to g6. We have rook a to f1, and now knight to h5. Really controlling a lot of squares here, f4 and g3, very, very nicely controlled. Also, this knight controls the f2 square. So here, g4, Anand has to get rid of this knight. Knight back to f6, and now knight to f4. We have knight to g5 by Magnus, attacking the rook, putting pressure on the h3 pawn, and rook 3 to f2. And here we have knight g back to e4. And this is a move move Magnus played, probably because he has the black pieces in Armageddon. He's trying to see if Vishy will go just knight f3, knight g5, knight f2, knight to e4, but of course he's not going to do that. If the game ends up in a draw, then black wins the game in Armageddon. So here Anand plays a rook back to g2, and now we have pawn to h6. We have h4, you have to push, you have to win. G5, attacking the knight. Captures, captures, now comes knight to h3, attacking the g5 pawn. King to g7, now Magnus says I might even use the open h-file to attack the white king, and now rook to f5. Here Anand goes after the g5 pawn, and Magnus just plays rook to h8, which is the correct idea. But here's the interesting part. Here we have knight captures on g5, just grabbing that pawn. And now Magnus, there is a move that Magnus should play. Magnus should play knight captures on g5, and after rook captures with check, king f8, and black is perfectly fine here. You have the e-file all to yourself, you have the h-file all to yourself, the knight is very strong, the queen is very strong, so black would be better here. However, after knight captures on g5, Magnus played rook to h4, now putting pressure on the on the g4 pawn, but now the position is winning for Anand, but only if you find one particular move that wins the game. So feel free to pause the video and win the game for Anand while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on spotting this move, as this is just an entire ocean of lines that you have to calculate in order to find this one. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, it is our good friend the bishop captures on d5. Yes, it is. That's the good stuff. So this is what Anand played, and now it's just... there's just no good move for Magnus. Now the pawn is gone, and the knight here is just being attacked 3 times. So you have to do something about this, and there's not all that much you can do. Let's see what happens if you just capture the bishop. And I mean, why wouldn't you? We're gonna play knight captures on e4, and now, okay, the queen is attacked. You also have to keep an eye on the knight. We're gonna play queen to e6. Now just queen to d2. Now we are planning queen g5 check. Now the rook will hang. So queen to h6, you have to defend. There's no good way to defend against to defend the knight on d5 and to prevent queen to g5. So that's just it. Let's say you play some like queen h6, queen g5 check, even captures with check. King has to move. We're gonna capture the knight here, and that's just it. Not all that much can be done here. Or you can even go knight to d6, attack this rook, and after, let's say, knight to f4, attacking the rook, we can even go into this knight captures on e8, knight captures on g2, captures, and now we are up 2 pawns. This is of course a completely winning endgame for white. So that's what happens if knight captures on d5. On the other hand, you could also play the tricky knight captures on c3, which is too much a bit to calculate for an Armageddon game, but it's a nice line, so we're going to discuss it, saying that, okay, I win back the pawn, and then I'm going to capture on d5, but Anand would say, nope, knight captures on f7. And now, what do you play? Your queen is hanging, there's just not a good move. Let's say rook e1 check, king f2, now queen e7. Makes sense. You want to play rook to h1. We're just going to play rook g5 check. And after king to f8, now comes knight to e5, and this is just resigns. Now you've disconnected the queen's defense of the rook, so king captures. Rook is a threat. Knight to g6 with this monster royal fork, also a threat, so there's just no playing this. So those are only some of the lines that are happening after bishop captures on d5, and I've shown you the ones that are actually good for black. So here Magnus instead wins for knight captures on g5. It is the absolute best line for black. But now after this move we have rook captures on g5 with check, king to f8, and now comes bishop back to f3. And here Anand allows Magnus to bounce back and go back into the game, because here the move you had to find was queen to g3. This just forces an endgame, and that's a winning endgame for Anand, because you force a queen trade as the queen and the rook are hanging. So here you would have to trade captures, and the endgame, of course, is completely winning for white. You would still have to play for it, but you are up 2 pawns. Of course, Anand will win this. So instead, Anand played bishop to f3, but now Magnus has a chance with queen to f4. And now rook to e5. If you go for d5, let's say you just push a pawn, then rook to e1 with check, king to f2, rook h to h1, and that's just terrible. There's just no playing this. Knight to e4, and of course white resigns. So you have to be careful. Anand plays rook to e5. He has to give up a pawn to survive this. He cannot allow rook to e1 check. So rook captures, pawn captures, queen captures, and now king to f2, not allowing the queen to infiltrate via the e file. And now Magnus has to play rook to h1, and it's such a fine move to see on the board, threatening queen to e1 checkmate, but instead Magnus plays rook to h3. Now he paralyzes the bishop, the queen is here, and of course it's also a very unpleasant move to see, but he allows Anand counterplay g5. Not just counterplay, but grabbing a better position. Knight to h5. Again, rook to h1 is always possible to throw in because it comes with the threat of checkmate. But Magnus plays knight to h5, and now Anand plays g6. And now you can no longer play rook to h1. If you play rook to h1 now the problem is queen d8 check, and after the king moves, g captures on f7 comes with check. And after king moves, bishop d5 check, the king has no squares. All of the squares are taken. You will have to capture the bishop, and now we just win the game easily. So here, after g6, what you have to find is queen to c5 check. But Magnus was incredibly low on time. He missed this move. The idea is, of course, you can't just go anywhere. This is taken by the rook. This is covered by the queen. So you have to be, if you go king to f1, for example, rook to h1 check, king e2, and now knight to f4, just completely blunders the game for white. So what you would have to find after queen to c5 check is actually just blocking with queen to d4, and here we would trade captures, and now the game continues with Magnus having chances to save the game. However, after this g6 move, Magnus played f captures and g6, and now just queen to d8 with check. This is the only winning move, and Anand finds it. We have queen to e8, we have trades, captures, and the rook captures on g6, and now how are you guarding the queenside pawns? We have knight to f4, now comes rook captures on a6, knight to d3 check, going after the pawn here, but Anand doesn't go after the rook. Anand plays the tricky king to e3, and he traps Magnus in a sort of a trap. It's not a real trap because you could still capture on b2 and continue playing the game, although after rook to a7, completely cutting off the king, moving the rook and pushing the a pawn, this would just be winning for white. However, here after this king to e3 move, knight to e5 was played, and we reached the position from the thumbnail. Now it seems like Magnus is winning the bishop here, but Magnus completely missed that rook to e6 check, picks up the knight, and he was in this position on move 50 that Magnus Carlsen resigned the game, as there is nothing more to be done here. Plus he had like 0 seconds on the clock, so I don't even know how this move was played, but it was. So yeah, that's the game. Hope you guys enjoyed it. The brilliant showing by Anand, as he had a winning position against Magnus in classical, and then he was able to beat him on demand in Armageddon with the white pieces. So incredible stuff. Of course, as the Magnus and Anand went into round 5 being tied, now Anand again takes the lead in the tournament, which is incredible. I mean, you lead the tournament, and in round 5 you face Magnus, and then you beat Magnus, and I think that's just an amazing result, and that well, now really he has to take it all the way. So we'll see what happens. It's a crazy event. Hope you guys are enjoying this short coverage. So yeah, that's the game. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Of course, now you lose the knight, and there's no point in continuing the game, so that's why Magnus resigned. I would like to thank Varun Sudarsanan, Richard Knapp, Raymond Young, Cedar Simmons, and David Kimura for your contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the coverage of the Norway Chess tournament until it finishes. So thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.